Chapter 19 is about inequality, about how income and wealth are distributed both within a country and across countries. And a lot of economists feel like we shouldn't talk about inequality so much because we should be focused more on growth and efficiency. But a lot of economics has to do with how uh, the productivity of firms and workers is distributed. And if we ignore that, then we ignore a lot of the conflict that happens, and it's not a helpful thing to do. So let's go through this and see sort of what we mean about inequality, where inequality comes from, and what, if anything, we want to do about it. So a lot of the uh, causes and consequences of inequality are already things that we've talked about a little bit. So when we talk about bargaining power, when we talk about the relationship between workers and firms, when we talk about the relationship between lenders and borrowers, we get these asymmetric outcomes, right? And often it has to do with who has more bargaining power, how many people are competing against each other. And then we can see that different societies have made different choices in how they want to combat inequality. And so we can think about whether, you know, our country, our society is where we want it to be. So as we talked about in chapter 1, actually, the Gini coefficient is one of the best ways to measure inequality. Remember, it goes from 0 to 1, where 1 is completely unequal. One person has all the income or wealth, and 0 means everybody has exactly the same. And then we'll talk about, how and if and when inequality should be addressed. So this is a nice graph here. It sort of shows inequality both between countries and uh, within countries. So along the main horizontal axis here, we have poorer to richer countries. So we go from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, India, China, Brazil, all the way up to the US and Norway. And then along the z-axis, we have poorer to richer people within a country. And so poorer are closer to us and richer are farther away. And then we have gross domestic income per capita on the vertical axis. So one thing you can see is how big India and China are. And one of the reasons that sort of global inequality has decreased recently is because of growth in countries like India and China. They account for, over a third of the world's population. You can also see that, it's much better to be poor in the United States than it is to be poor in China or India. But you might actually prefer to be poor in Japan, right? So the bottom decile here in Japan is taller than the bottom decile here in the United States. But you can also see that the rich in the United States are richer than anywhere else. And so these names here, Stephanie, Mark, Renfu, Yichen, they're just from stories, descriptions of different types of people in the textbook. So you can see that there is a huge wide range of income inequality both within countries and between countries. And that's some of the things that we're going to talk about in this chapter. So where does inequality come from? Well, a lot of it has to do with where you start, differences in endowments, right? So who your parents are, what country you were born into, and then what kind of education you get, what kind of technology and institutions you have to work with within your country. Um, when we talk about classes, we're usually talking, in this case, social classes. We're usually talking about differences in interests, right? So it used to be that the main class difference was between owners and workers. Now there are different, there are class differences between people who are educated and people who are less educated, people who live in developed countries versus people who live in less developed countries. And so we're going to talk about all of those things and, excuse me, how inequality sort of results from these different endowments and what, if anything, we can do about it. So we've already, as I said, we've already talked a lot about different um, situations in which inequality can result. So we talked about a landlord versus a farmer, right? And how much rent gets paid, and that's going to depend on how many potential farmers there are, how many landlords there are, what the rules are in terms of who gets what. We talked about borrowing and lending, right? What's the interest rate? The lender benefits from a higher interest rate, the borrower benefits from a lower interest rate, and competition between lenders, between borrowers, can affect who gets what. We also talked about specialization in trade, and one of the things we said was that both parties can benefit from specializing in trading, but how much each one benefits depends on their relative bargaining power. One of the most important sources of inequality, especially from an everyday point of view, is the relationship between firms and employees. And that's where a lot of income inequality comes from. And in this country, at least, income inequality is generally what is driving wealth inequality. And we'll talk about the differences between the two in a later video. So all of these issues are going to be important. All of them are going to lead to more or less inequality depending on the institutions that are set up to govern them. And so we'll talk about each of these in turn.